Welcome back. This is session 2 of corporate governance. This is a series on corporate governance and King 4 that has a separate playlist on my channel. So if you want to see the other videos in this playlist or in the series, please click on that playlist. So in the last video, you'll remember that we went through an introduction of King 4 and corporate governance. In this video, however, we will be learning in depth about the application of principles 1 to 7 of King 4. So we will actually be doing detailed work in this video. We want to try by the end of this video to be able to apply King 4. So that is our aim and that's our objective of this video. When you are taking notes, I want you to look out for the following. I want you to look out to see what sort of direction is required. So what sort of direction should the board of directors give or the governing body give to the rest of the entity? What can be delegated by the governing body? And who can the governing body delegate? More particularly, I want you to pay attention to what can be delegated to management, because management is an important part of the entity. Let's pay attention also to find out what and how should the governing body monitor or oversee the implementation. And then finally, what needs to be disclosed. Now, when you're taking down these notes, it's important because when we are reading through our scenario, and this is some exam technique for you, when we are reading through our scenario, we want to be able to identify what is being done that's wrong. So we want to try and identify non-compliance with King 4. If you are able to identify these 4 components of each and every principle, then we'll be in a much better place when we want to try and identify what is being done wrong. King 4 starts off generally talking about leadership and generally talking about ethical leadership more particularly. So principle 1 is really focused around ethical leadership. Now you will remember that when we went over ethical leadership in the last video, we spoke about a few things like integrity. We also spoke about the governing body being competent and responsibility and accountability, and then fairness in their actions. You would also remember that we spoke about the transparency of their disclosures. Now that is what this principle is all based around. So this principle is going to start talking more in depth about that, and we want to focus in as students and as practitioners, we want to try and focus in on what needs to be done by the board and how it affects the board. This is going to help us because when we're reading our scenario, our case studies, and when we're doing tests and exams, we need to be able to identify what is not being done and what should be done. So we want to be able to identify non-compliance and give some sort of recommended practice to the governing body. So let's try and pay attention and see if we can't spot these things. The first section of this principle deals with integrity. I have based this slide around the actions that need to be done. Now, if you have a look at the slide that's up on your screen, you're going to see it all begins with A's. So we have the 3 A's under integrity. The governing body needs to try and cultivate the actions that are being done by various members of a company need to be in good faith. This means that they don't act in their own advantage only, but they act in the advantage of the company and of all stakeholders in general. They also need to act with due care and competence. The next A is trying to avoid conflicts. Now you will remember in video 1 we spoke about the alternative dispute resolution. This is where that alternative dispute resolution comes into place. Now the governing body needs to be able to disclose and explain what sort of conflicts may come about. And in semester 2, when we dig deep into the Companies Act, you will find that there's actually a specific section that deals with conflict of interests. And that section is section 75. So note that down for the future. It is important to note that when we are testing and examining King 4, we often will test and examine it together with the Companies Act. Not in first semester, but only in the second semester. Once we've completed Companies Act, these 2 topics are very interlinked and they will be tested together. So pay attention to where King 4 interlinks with Companies Act, and you can use that in the next semester. when we're dealing with King 4, we want to try and avoid as many conflicts as possible, and we do that by disclosing our personal interests as directors, as governing body members. They disclose their personal interests to the rest of the governing body and to all involved stakeholders, and what the conflicts were and how they were resolved. Now, as mentioned previously, when we were talking about the regime or framework of apply and explain, we said that if someone were not wanting to implement good corporate governance, they would only do what is minimally required. They will only do what they need to do. That is where we come to the next A, which is acting ethically beyond what the law requires. When we act ethically beyond what the law requires, we interpret the law for the spirit of the law. So we go and we try and understand, why is the law saying this? Once we understand the spirit or principle behind the law, we are able to implement our actions in a way that ensures that not only is the law met, but also we try and mitigate the risk and eliminate the root cause of whatever we are dealing with. Now, this is what we are talking about here. The governing body needs to go beyond the law and implement the law in such a way that it eliminates the root causes or the root areas of non-compliance. So that's what we talk about when we say the governing body needs to act beyond the law. And then finally, we deal with the actions through tone and culture. Now, this is critically important for the governing body because they are the leaders of an entity. They set the tone at the top. And that tone will filter down to employees and other stakeholder groups. If the governing body does not have a good tone and does not set good corporate governance example, you find that the rest of the entity will suffer. Now, you often heard that phrase, a fish rots from its head. So the problem is always at the top. If there's an ethical issue, it generally always happens at the governing body. And so this is what we are talking about here. They need to be able to set the tone and set the culture of the entity to indicate that part of the entity's culture is to ensure that there's good corporate governance. So that's what we are talking about there. So these are just to reiterate what we were saying and to put it in a bit more detail. And remember now, all of these things that we've been talking about under integrity, they all have a common theme. And those common themes is some sort of doing that needs to happen. We need to either avoid, now that's a doing word. We need to avoid something. We need to act in good faith. We need to act beyond what the law requires. We need to ensure that our actions set an ethical tone. So we want to try and emphasize that under this principle, we're looking for the actions that the entity is doing. So when you are reading your scenario, when you are reading your test question, I want you to try and dig deeper to try and find out what the actions are. What exactly is the board doing to meet the requirement of principle 1? And if you read your question in that way, you'll be able to spot the areas of non-compliance a lot easier. The next thing we want to go on under principle 1 is competence. Now, we said that the governing body has to be competent to execute their duties. This means that they are working with the accurate knowledge or skills that are required. They take due care and diligence when they're doing their work, and also that they lead and they continue to lead with an emphasis on competence. So their leadership is not only competent, but it emphasizes competence going forward. When we are looking at all of these words, we come up with the theme under this section is ability. We need to identify ability not only in the governing body, but also in the staff that are employed by the governing body. Do they have the abilities to meet and execute their responsibilities? Now, when we are reading our questions, let's try and look for ability. We're going to deal with responsibility and accountability together. With the responsibility, we want to try and understand, does the governing body ensure that the entity understands that there's collective responsibility to meet the requirements of the governing body, which we had abbreviated as SOAP. So the governing body, even though they are the leaders, they are not there on a daily basis, and they are not able to do the daily actions that will ensure that the objectives or responsibilities of the governing body are met. So they need to ensure that the entity understands it's a collective, they're acting as one, and there's a joint agreement between them when they're making these actions. They also need to ensure that looking forward, they identify risks and possible opportunities for their entity. So that may involve doing a SWOT analysis. Many individuals, including students, often will want to take responsibility when something goes right, but never when something goes wrong. So, for example, if a student fails, they feel it's never their fault, it's always the educator's fault or the lecturer's fault. But King 4 talks about when you are emphasizing accountability, you have to take responsibility for negative outcomes, not only the positive outcomes. And that indicates ethical and responsible leadership on the part of the governing body and also on the part of students who acknowledge that they have not been able to pass an exam and some fault will lie on their shoulders. So that's important that we understand that they need to be able to take responsibility for negative outcomes. They also need to ensure that they prepare and are able to dig deeper and understand and ask questions about documents and financial statements so that when they come to board meetings, they're adding value. So they talk about the add value of board meetings. So this is what we need to emphasize and what the governing body needs to emphasize in their duties. All of these things are talking to the answers for their actions. So not only does the governing body have the responsibility to implement the actions, which we dealt with a few slides ago where we're dealing with integrity, but also they need to be responsible for the results of their actions. And this is what comes out in this slide. So when we are reading our scenario, let's look for the possibility that the governing body is being responsible for the results of their actions. The next thing we want to go on to is fairness. Now, under fairness, I've used a scale to depict what this really talks about. And I think this is quite serious because under fairness, you find that the governing body seems to be incentivized to take into account only shareholders or only stakeholders that are in their current or inner environment. But you find that an entity has a large impact on the external environment that they operate in. So when we're dealing with fairness, we want to ensure that the governing body weighs up the different responsibilities, the different needs, the different wants, and the different effects that their actions will have on not only the stakeholders that are in front of them, which is, for example, shareholders, employees, debtors, and community, close community, but also we want to ensure that the governing body is thinking about their future, thinking about the environment, thinking about society in general, and taking into account all of these various needs and wants when they're making their decision. And this is where we talk about fairness. The next section that we're going to get into is transparency and disclosure. Now, we've already touched on this a little bit in video 1, but this is a critical part of an entity being able to lead ethically is to account for what they have done. And this talks back to the fact that there needs to be a corporate governance report that is prepared by each entity explaining how they have dealt with the corporate governance issues, and therefore holding themselves accountable, doing a self-evaluation, holding themselves accountable. So that is what we talk about when we're talking about transparency. In the next slide, we're just going to summarize exactly what the recommended practices are. So we say that an entity must be able to cultivate a culture of both individual and collective integrity, competence, responsibility, accountability, and fairness. We do this by ensuring that our strategy is achieved over time and our strategy aligns with these various objectives of a board of directors. And then also we constantly check in and monitor ourselves by disclosing. That is principle 1. Let's move on to principle 2. Principle 2 talks about having a good organizational ethical culture. Now, how do we ensure that as governing body members, we make sure that our entity has a good ethical culture? So governing bodies can do this methodologically, and we do that by firstly setting the ethical direction. That means that we identify what we want our company to be known for from an ethical standpoint. Do we want our company to be known for good ethics or bad ethics? Obviously, we want our company to be known for good ethics. Then we develop and structure codes of conduct as well as policies around that. Then give each and every member of our entity a chance to review this code of conduct and comment on it, etc. And we then must ensure that we implement it. When it's implemented by management, here at the bottom, management gets involved and starts to implement it. We then need to have a monitoring situation where we monitor the application of codes and conducts and even deal with any people or departments that have broken a code of conduct. And finally, we disclose. So this is what we are talking about. We first, when setting the ethical direction, we want to speak to stakeholders and we want to try and understand what are the needs and responsibilities of an entity. We then are going to develop codes of conduct and then publish it, making sure that it's freely available to everyone. This may include training, staff training. This may include incorporating outside contractors in order to assist us. Finally, we can have some sort of method or framework for application. Now, when I say method or framework, you can have the old way of having a reward or punishment system, or you can have a system of having an apply or explain, like recommended by King 4. All of them, though, need to have a whistleblowing system. Whistleblowing means when someone who is not senior in the entity is able to call management to account, and they do that through a private line where they indicate wrongdoing by management or someone in leadership, and that then gets dealt with. When we're talking about implementation, we need to talk about implementation from the beginning, from recruiting to ensure that compliance is rewarded and non-compliance is punished, and then we protect people who are whistleblowers. This slide just summarizes in words what we have already spoken about, where we talk about how entities need to delegate to management to ensure that codes of conduct are being applied and implemented, and how disclosure needs to happen. Principle 3 is talking about the governing body ensuring that each and every organization is a good corporate citizen. Now, you will remember in video 1, we spoke about what it means to be a good corporate citizen. A good corporate citizen is an entity that takes responsibility for what is happening around the entity, so not only in the internal environment, but also in the external environment, and also ensures that no specific stakeholder is harmed by their actions. So what does a governing body need to do to ensure that their entity is a good corporate citizen? The first is they need to set the direction. They need to identify what laws, what standards, what policies need to be met, and put in place codes of conduct, codes of ethics, and procedures in order to make sure that those laws and standards, etc., are met. We then want to oversee and monitor the implementation of such codes. We can do this by monitoring the status of the entity, how the entity is perceived by external stakeholders, and then finally we want to be able to disclose what we have identified and the actions that we have done. The governing body is allowed to delegate this responsibility of ensuring that an entity is a good corporate citizen to a subcommittee. A subcommittee is a group of directors that is formed in order to achieve a specific goal. The specific subcommittee that deals with corporate citizenship is called the Social and Ethics Committee. The Social and Ethics Committee is required to manage the ethics of the entity as well as ensure that there are societal relations, particularly on remuneration policies of governing body members and top management. Let's look at an example of how King 4 should be applied. If an entity were able to avoid tax, evade tax, or pay the full tax that is required, what should an entity do? If we apply King 4 very narrowly, that would mean that an entity should pay all tax that is required, not attempting to avoid it, which may be legal but is frowned upon, and definitely not attempting to evade tax, which is actually illegal. So this is an example of how King 4 can be applied to tax. Point 4 talks about the governing body's responsibility to ensure an entity's core purpose is being met. And for many entities, the core purpose is value creation. Notice we have not said profit generation, but value creation. Because even entities that are not for profit will create some sort of value to their dependents. So this particular principle has been structured in such a way that it is able to be implemented by not-for-profit entities as well as profit entities. So how should a governing body go about ensuring that an entity meets its core purpose or core goals? The first is the governing body needs to set the direction, the purpose, the strategy or mission of an entity. This means sitting down and delineating or writing out why an entity exists. This is a key exercise, and many of you all would have done this exercise when you all did Management 120. Why is this so important? Because without this direction, the entity will not be able to meet their goals. It's as if they are shooting in the dark because they don't know what their goals are. The next is delegation. When we say delegation, we mean that the governing body requests top management to write out documents and research the goals that need to be met and how they are going to be met. This planning process is critical because without a detailed plan, we won't be able to meet the goal. The governing body is then responsible to approve all of the plans and policies that management has created and then oversee what exactly management has done. After that process is completed, we come back to the beginning where management needs to again sit down and see what still needs to be done in order to meet the goal. And this process is an iterative process, meaning that it happens more than once. So just to summarize, the governing body is required to steer and set the direction for an entity. The governing body is then able to delegate the formulation of detailed strategies or plans to management. The governing body still has the responsibility to approve these detailed plans or policies that management has created. The governing body may delegate the implementation of the policy back to management. However, ultimately, the governing body is responsible for the implementation. Remember what we spoke about in the previous slide, where the governing body needs to be able to take responsibility for negative consequences. That's where this applies. And then finally, the governing body needs to be alert to any changes or variabilities that happen in the entity and its environment in order to restructure and re-look at the strategy and purpose of the entity. Notice that this slide just deals with the preparation or creation of the policy. Now, the next slide deals with the implementation of the policy. So what can be delegated? Not only the creation of the policy, but also the implementation of the policy. Notice that they have to oversee implementation and then oversee the ongoing assessment. Being alert to going concern issues and other threats or risks that may be posed to an entity may mean delving deep into financial ratios, which you guys learn in math. Principle 5 deals with the reporting that the governing body needs to do. The governing body needs to set the direction for the tone and detailedness of the reporting that needs to be done. Before any reports are released to stakeholders, the governing body must approve all reports. The governing body must ensure that the entity is compliant with all legal reporting requirements. or ethical reporting requirements, and finally determine materiality. When we say set direction, we want to ensure that the entity understands the conduct and approach that they need to have to reporting. When we talk about approving frameworks, we are talking about approving the accounting frameworks and other frameworks of reporting, but also approving individual reports. The governing body may not be required to prepare a report, but they will oversee the compilation by other people. Approving the basis for materiality means that the governing body needs to assess what would cause a stakeholder to change their decision. This is a difficult and judgmental decision, an area to approve, and so the governing body needs to be very careful in doing that. Overall, the governing body is responsible for the integrity of all external reports and also to make sure that the King Code disclosure is made. When we talk about the AIR or AIR, that is the Annual Integrated Report. This is one of the main reports that is created for each entity, and the governing body is solely responsible for the integrity of this report. As mentioned previously, the governing body can be held liable if the King 4 disclosure is not made adequately. The board of directors are the custodians for corporate governance in an entity. That means that they are the ones that need to protect and ensure that corporate governance is achieved. They do this by exercising their leadership role. They have a charter and approve a protocol that ensures that committees as well as other professional service staff act ethically. This may involve even approving policies and protocols for non-executive members of the governing body that ensures that they get required documentation and are able to add value to governing body meetings. Another way that the governing body can ensure that they are the custodians of corporate governance is to disclose the number of meetings that they have and who has attended these meetings. This ensures that they satisfy the stakeholders that they have discharged their responsibilities in relation to the entity. The governing body will be ultimately held accountable if there is a drop or decrease in corporate governance. Next, we will be moving on to Principle 7. Just a word of warning. Just a word of warning. Principle 7 is the beginning of the business end of King 4. This means that Principles 7 to 10 are often tested in tests and exams. So you should pay particular attention to these principles. This principle emphasizes that governing body members need to have the required skills, experience, diversity, and independence in order to discharge their responsibilities. We can achieve this by ensuring that the governing body is correctly composed. This will involve the governing body setting the direction for how a governing body should be composed. The board should determine the appropriate number of governing body members, the skills that may be required by the governing body members. That may include experience, mixes of executive and non-executive, and the number of qualified members. It may also include the governing body indicating the quorum that needs to be in place before a meeting is declared open. The governing body should ensure that at least one executive member, which means top management member, is represented on the governing body. In most companies, this person is the CEO. However, what we find on the JSE is that many times the CEO and CFO are represented on governing bodies. These are because they are the people that make the most number of important decisions in an entity. The governing body needs to ensure staggered rotation, which means that only 1 or 2 members in a given financial year is changed on the governing body. This ensures that the entity does not lose a large number of experienced individuals, and that anyone that is new is able to acclimatize and gain skills that are required in order to execute their duties. Not only that, ensuring rotation prevents old mindsets from setting into the entity and ensures that new ideas are constantly coming forth. Staggered rotation will also form part of the succession plan, meaning that key members of the governing body have an elected person that will replace them. King 4 makes it very clear that the governing body must have a majority of non-executive members, and the majority of those non-executive members must be independent. We will talk a bit more about independence later. Let's move on to nomination, election, and appointment of governing body members. When directors are being appointed to the governing body, it must be a transparent and formal process that meets the requirements of the Memorandum of Incorporation and the Companies Act. When a candidate is nominated to be elected to the board, the entire governing body must approve that candidate. That approval will take into consideration collective skills of the current governing body, the skills that the new member will bring, the ability of the new member to execute their duties. This will include their reputation and their capacity to do work. Before a candidate is accepted as a governing body member, the governing body should assess their other commitments. This means assessing the number of boards they are on already. Thorough background checks and CV checks will be done. When a new member is elected to the governing body, a program of professional development must be undertaken in which risks, skills, and changes in the regulatory and legislative environment are explained to the governing body member that is new. Let's move on to independence. Members of the governing body are required on an annual basis to submit all other interests that they may have and all related parties. This ensures that the governing body has a complete list of possible conflicts that may arise. If a meeting does take place where a member has a conflict, at the beginning of the meeting, this member must make sure that the rest of the governing body understands that they have a conflict. They should then limit themselves from voting. It is interesting to note that for particular issues, a member may be listed as not independent, but on other issues, a member may be independent. Let's talk a little bit about independence. When a member is appointed as independent, they have to be non-executive, meaning that they cannot be part of top management. If they are appointed as independent, an independent third person should be able to assess them as being independent. That means that if you had no ties to the entity, you would consider a given governing body member to be independent. What can limit independence? A governing body member is not independent if they have a financial interest in the entity. That may mean owning shares or securities, having share-based payments, being an executive or part of top management in the last 3 years, being the auditor in the last 3 years, being a significant or ongoing professional advisor to the company, being a governing body member of another company that is either a competitor or a supplier, being entitled to remuneration based on the performance of the entity. So, just to clarify, there are 3 types of directors. You're going to have an executive director who is part of top management. You then have a non-executive director who is someone that is not part of top management. And then you have an independent executive director who is someone that is not part of top management and is independent of the entity. When a director is declared as independent, this is not a title that can last for forever. Instead, every 9 years, their independence needs to be assessed again. If a given director is declared as independent after 9 years, so basically for the 10th year, then there is an excessive amount of disclosure that needs to be made by the governing body to explain why the person is considered to be independent. Not only that, a complete list of disclosures needs to be made in order to explain the composition of governing bodies. This may include, but is not limited to, the number of executive and non-executive directors, the length of service of each of the directors, including their ages, the reasons for directors being removed, resigning, or retiring, and what are the targets of the governing body in terms of gender, race, and skills. Next, let's talk about the chairman of the board. The chairman of the board is required to be an independent executive director, meaning that they should not be part of top leadership. However, in an extreme case, when an independent executive director is not able to be appointed, then a lead independent executive director must be appointed. And this member is appointed in order to counteract any bias that may be in place in the chairperson. The lead independent director is meant to help the chairperson, to assist them by being an intermediary between the chairperson and other directors, to deal with shareholders' concerns where normal channels have failed to resolve their concerns, to strengthen independence in the board if a chairperson is not independent, and to ensure that all decisions taken by the governing body are free of conflict of interests. In addition, the lead independent non-executive director will assess the performance of the chairperson. The chief executive officer or CEO is not allowed to be the chairperson, because if he were allowed, then he would have far too much power. A former CEO cannot be elected as a chairman until 3 years has expired. This is how important it is to ensure that the CEO and chairperson positions stay separate. Before a chairperson is appointed, it needs to be determined the number of outside professional appointments that they already have. This is to ensure that they have enough time and enough ability to execute the responsibilities of chairperson. The chairperson should not be a member of the audit committee, because that will enable them to be too powerful in terms of independence. Chairperson should not be the chair of the remuneration committee but may be a member. They should be a member of the nominations committee and may also be the chair. They may be a member of the risk committee and may also be the chair. They may be a member of the social and ethics committee but may not be the chair. The board of directors should ensure that there is a succession plan for the chairperson. The entity should disclose whether the chairperson is considered to be independent and whether a lead independent director has been appointed. Now that we've dealt with Principle 7, which deals with the composition of the governing body as well as the office of the chair, in the next video we will be dealing with Principle 8, which deals with the subcommittees of the board. I would encourage you to join me then, as we are now entering a very key part of King 4. Thank you, and see you back next time.